Castlevania Lords of Shadow is a game of contradictions. Its lead character, Gabriel Belmont, finds himself equipped with great combat abilities and more than enough special skills to combat the forces of evil and avenge the death of his love. But for the player, it's almost overkill. A good portion of Belmont's unlocked special skills are only truly necessary when solving environmental puzzles. Similarly, Lords of Shadow is an astoundingly beautiful game, filled with expansive views of a broken world dotted with solemn waterfalls, sinister forests, and decaying ancient cities. But you won't be exploring much of these locales because the game is very strict about where you can go and how you can get there, delivering only an illusion of freedom conjured by a combination of invisible walls and platforms just out of reach. As these and other facets of the game continually butt heads, it becomes clear that Castlevania is largely a mishmash of mostly incongruous ideas taken from some of gaming's finest moments. And it's those very same moments that ultimately define the game but sadly strip it of an identity to call its own. The story does a fairly reasonable job in setting things up and explaining why Gabriel Belmont fights massive titans as well as hordes of werewolves, zombies, vampires, and other mainstays from the vintage horror assembly line. It's a rich universe to be sure, but Lords of Shadow rarely ever uses it as more than background filler in most cases. And to its credit, Lords of Shadow never implements or even needs cutscenes to balance a lack of content because it's a surprisingly long game with dozens of levels and solid challenge. The game takes about 15 to 20 hours to beat. And as with most games, that time is peppered with good and bad experiences. In the specific case of Lords of Shadow, those good moments are usually quite entertaining, bordering on spectacular. But the bad moments are just downright frustrating and not for the right reasons. Having a tutorial-like structure at the beginning of a game does not create much of an issue. Indeed, in the early parts of Lords of Shadow, the helpful messages at the top of the screen serve their purpose, helping you navigate ledges, open locked doors, and complete other environmental puzzles. But then they appear in the 3rd level, the 4th level, the 5th level, and further into the game, giving hints in areas that only require the slightest bit of thought. Ultimately, these breadcrumbs and their ubiquity convey a lack of faith in the game's ability to present a logical solution or path, and in your ability to find those solutions within a reasonable amount of time. There are also those moments with or without hints that are completely infuriating, and it's not because of difficulty spawned out of cleverness, but rather difficulty spawned from Lords of Shadow's own limitations and shortcomings. It can be anything from a ledge or enemies partially obscured by the game's fixed camera, to a timed puzzle that requires Gabriel to deftly move in a way he obviously wasn't intended to move. It's a testament then to the core combat mechanics in Castlevania Lords of Shadow that they're as well executed as they are despite the needless depth afforded by those relics found later in the game. But then again, they should be because they're unabashedly cribbed from the God of War games. Armed with his combat cross whip, Gabriel performs 2 different kinds of attacks, short but strong as well as sweeping but weak strikes, that he can use in conjunction with jumps, throws, blocks, and rolls for counters. Additionally, as Gabriel ventures further, he also comes across sub-weapons in the form of daggers, fairies, holy water, and a crystal that unleashes a suitably odd and very naked creature capable of wiping out most enemies with a single hit. More attacks for the combat cross and sub-weapons are available for purchase as you make headway toward the land of the vampires and earn more points by defeating enemies. Some of these moves are more useful than others, so it's entirely possible to get by with just purchasing 1 or 2 and never looking at the skills menu ever again. Gabriel also has 2 kinds of magic at his disposal. One type when activated heals him when he attacks enemies, while the other inflicts more damage. When magic is introduced in Lords of Shadow, it feels forced. It's almost like another idea being thrown into a game that tries to incorporate a bit of everything to appease as many people as possible. But it does end up working well in conjunction with the combat system, especially during boss battles. There are 2 types of boss battles in Lords of Shadow. One type is against incredibly strong foes, namely the Lords of Shadow. The other type is a Titan battle, where Gabriel maneuvers his way up the appendages of a massive creature to find its weak spots and take it down. It's quite a blatant takeoff of Shadow of the Colossus, but Lords of Shadow pays proper tribute with its own intense and memorable versions of that formula by playing up Gabriel's ability to use his primary weapon as a grappling hook. If anything, these Titan battles are also some of the most visually impressive portions in the game, where awe-inspiring scenery is already plentiful. It's almost a shame that Gabriel runs so fast, because there are times when it becomes necessary to stop and appreciate the amount of effort that went into the great span of environments in Lords of Shadow. It's just a beautiful game. As for the character models, Gabriel looks fantastic, but it's pretty clear that secondary characters weren't given as much attention and look rather bland in some instances. It's also worth noting that while the PlayStation 3 version tended to maintain a steady frame rate, the Xbox 360 version encountered some odd frame rate hiccups at times during action sequences and cutscenes. But no matter the version, another impressive aspect of Castlevania Lords of Shadow is its soundtrack. The epic score fits perfectly well with the game, and the only issues that arise are the frequent playing of the main battle song, which triggers when Gabriel gets into a fight, and the fact that there just aren't that many different songs overall. Still, it's one of the few areas where Castlevania successfully carves out its own identity from the games that it obviously provided its inspiration. All of this leaves Castlevania Lords of Shadow in a position where it takes bits and sometimes chunks of ideas from other games to reboot the series for a more contemporary audience. It borrows ideas from God of War, Shadow of the Colossus, and other games because those ideas are the core of what makes those games work. And to the game's credit, it takes more than a bit of skill to make all of these ideas gel together in a way that doesn't produce a disparate train wreck. Still, the experience isn't without faults. The combat is great and the boss battles are quite memorable, but it all starts to disintegrate when the adventure aspects come into play. It's a good start for a series in need of some new blood, so to speak. It's just unfortunate that so much of it had to come from other games and not an original source.